good morning, home church. This is a little different than I know the videos you've been getting. I actually tried to do it on my property last night, and that did not work out. But I wanted to share with you guys over the next couple weeks, we're going to be going through Galatians. This week is basically just going to be the overview. We're going to be looking at Galatians 1 through 9. And there's a couple things that I want to give you before you guys dive in to think about. There's some historical context I feel like you do need to keep in mind. First, this letter is kind of addressing social and racial division within the church. The Galatian church is one of the first churches that Paul planted. And that racial issue and the cultural issue really came from the fact that Paul was given a vision to go out and minister to the non-Jews, so the Gentiles. And frankly, a lot of Jewish Christians had a problem with that. And they felt things should be done a certain way. But Paul was the one given the vision by God, so Paul was doing it the way that God had obviously called him to do. Now, those cultural divisions and the disunity that it caused were honestly because there was a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of the gospel by these teachers that came in after Paul, trying to implement some of the same restrictions that the Jews had. And what it was really doing, it was adding to the gospel. It was changing the gospel message. One of the other things about this letter that Paul wrote, which I think is super important, is the fact, I believe this fact is really missed out on. And that is, a lot of times we look at the gospel as it's for the unbeliever. It's what ushers them into the faith. And a lot of times, people are looking for more, for lack of a better explanation, maybe more meat instead of milk, as some people call it. And they want to study, different things and move on. But the fact is, the gospel is not just for the new believer or the unsaved. It is for every believer, regardless of the stage of your Christian life and your spiritual walk. And Paul discusses that in Galatians. He discusses the fact that the gospel is for the believer. And we know that because when he writes this, what I would call Galatians as a bombshell of truth in reference to the gospel, he writes this to the church. He writes it to the Christians. So the three main points that you're going to get, or hopefully get out of verses 1 through 9, is first, there's a desertion from the gospel. The new believers, and I say new, it's been probably, Paul wrote this letter about 15 years after Christ's death. So this was one of the first churches he planted, as I mentioned before. But it comes to a situation where Paul is frustrated because when you look at the beginning of Galatians, if you look at verses 1 through 5, that opening to that letter is much different than if you read Ephesians or Philippians, where that is more of a, hey, I'm glad to talk to you, and it's a very warm welcome or opening. The opening to Galatians has a bit of fire in it. He's not very happy with what has occurred. And he's having to assert the authority that God has given him in this mission field. But the first point is the desertion. If you look at verses 6, 7, and 9, you see where other people have come in and they've added things to the gospel. And that's a desertion from the truth. And Paul's not just frustrated with those false teachers. He's frustrated with the Galatians themselves because they were so easily removed from what they knew to be true. The second is Paul's authority. Paul was a Christian and an apostle that had a different background than many. If you know Paul's story, Paul was actually Saul of Tarsus, and he was the hired gun for the religious sects of those days to hunt down the Christians. And while we don't have any evidence that he participated physically in any of those acts, he was instigating them, he was holding coats, he was a big part of it. And this was strange for the Christians in Jerusalem or the Jewish Christians, to have this guy come in and say, hey, I'm an apostle because I had this encounter face to face with Jesus. That was different. And people didn't like that. They also didn't like the fact that Paul, was given a vision to go minister outside the Jewish community. So there were points where Christians, took some shots at him, for lack of a better example or term, and they would go after his authority. But if you look at verses 1, 8, and 9, and even if you look at Acts 9, 1 through 19, you see where Paul gets his authority from. The last point is really the gospel defined. Paul gives a crash course in Galatians on what the gospel is and what it's not. We are helpless and lost. If I would give you one word that describes what the gospel, what Jesus does through the gospel, for us, for you and I, it's that he rescued us. It's a rescue. Without him, without the gospel, as we know, we are lost. There's nothing we can do to earn favor with God. And the problem is when you start adding things, because the gospel is really, grace. It's grace plus nothing. But when you start saying grace plus, like the Jewish community was doing and saying, you have to be circumcised, or you can't eat this meat, and you can't do this, and you can't do that. What ends up happening is, just like in this case, it becomes confusing to the people involved, because the reality is you have got 1 foot in grace and 1 foot in legalism. It doesn't work. So I want to leave you with that this morning. Like I said, over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be trailing through this or blazing through this. Feel free to send me any questions that you may have. I know this video is long. Shara says 1 minute. Joseph, I couldn't do it. So it looks like it's 6 minutes and 50 seconds. So I'm going to be praying for you guys this morning, and may God bless as you open his word.